your memory can lie to you. And it's not because you're careless and it's not because you're malfunctioning, but it's because memory was never designed to work like a filing cabinet. Because if memory was just a filing cabinet, then false memories should not exist. But we're going to see today that they do. And we're also going to ask a deeper question that if memory is not stored like files, then how is knowledge actually organized in the mind? So that's what we're going to be pivoting to later on today, taking a look at how all of this information in your human mind is actually connected to other information and what implications that has for cognition and what that lets us predict about how we can learn and what do we learn and how do we behave and why do we behave in that way. So we're going to see how your information is organized in your mind has really important implications for how we interact and behave in the world. So today we're going to uh, tackle the question of memory reconstruction, which leads directly into false memories. We're going to do an in-class demo. We are going to take a look at the story of Genevieve, which is a woman who is using memory reconstruction in a very important therapeutic goal. And then we are going to have a brief aside on the importance of learning how to write. And then take a look at semantic networks and introduce one of the most influential initial semantic networks that was proposed, really being Colin and Killian's hierarchical model. So before we get to memory reconstruction, we'll just introduce Genevieve very briefly. So this is a real case that we're going to take a look at involving someone who experienced a traumatic event. So Genevieve suffered a sexual assault, and later she struggled with intrusive memories that returned, and this was the really crippling part, returned with the same emotional intensity when they were formed. So those memories did not fade the way that most memories do. So her case raised a very important question. If memories are reconstructed each time that we recall them, could that reconstruction possibly be used therapeutically? Could we use the fact that your memory is getting reconstructed every time you remember things to maybe help people like Genevieve who are dealing with really, really traumatic memories? So that is going to be the end goal of what we're going to look at memory reconstruction for. So your memories are constantly being reconstructed. Every single time that you access a memory, that memory gets reconstructed. So it's not simply accessed like files, it's not simply taken in whole from a location in your, for example, long term memory. Rather, it's rewritten with every single recall. So every single time you recall a memory, you have rewritten that memory. And just like copying notes over and over and over and over again, sometimes that means that you can add in things that weren't there in the original memory, also known as a false memory. So we're going to be doing an in-class demo now just to demonstrate that. So we're not going to have the law of large numbers working on our side today for this in-class demo, but hopefully it will work with some of us. So this is an in-class demo. This is a memory test. You are going to see a list of words and you are going to be told when you can try to recall those words. And then once that prompt is given, try to recall the words, as many of them as you can. Does not matter which order you recall them in. Just do your best to try to recall as many words as possible. So any questions before we begin the demo? All right. So you'll get a 10-second countdown. These are not the words to remember. Sí, sí. Y, su, All right. So try to recall, write down as many words that were on the list as you possibly can. All right. So let's see how we did. So you can check the words that you put on your list against the words that were presented there. So take a look at how many of those you were able to recall. So the words were bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, and drowsy. All right. So there were 15 words on the list, and you might have remembered 10 of them. You might have remembered 12. You might be just a memory savant and remembered all 15. But the really important part of this memory test, surprisingly, were the words that were not on the list. So the key result in the experiment that used these lists initially was, did you recall a word that was actually not presented? And that word was sleep. So did anybody write down the word sleep? Okay, so we have uh, evidence for false memories. So we're going to stop here just for a moment because some of us wrote down the word sleep, but sleep was never presented. So this is the question: why would your memory, because you were accessing your memory for things that actually occurred, produce a word that never actually appeared? What do you think might have happened?
They all had to do like, all the words that were presented had to do with sleeping. So, maybe subconsciously, my brain was, just thinking about everything that's related to sleep, so sleep must have been that.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the leading kind of explanations. And that's exactly how this list was created. So this list was created by using word inventories where they literally ask hundreds of people, give me the first word that comes to mind when I say sleep. And some people said bed, some people said rest, some people said awake. And they literally take the top 15 that occurs the most often, make the list out of that, but don't have sleep on it. So when you're reconstructing this list, one of the ideas is that you're reconstructing from what you just listened to, but you're not just replaying the list, you're reconstructing the meaning as well along with it. And every single one of those kind of suggests a theme, the theme of sleep. And then your mind generates something that actually fits that theme while you're trying to recall what was actually on the list. So, bed is associated with sleep, rest is associated with sleep, awake is associated with sleep. And all of those little pieces basically get, when they get reconstructed, kind of pull sleep along with them. And the chances are very high that you're going to write the word sleep down on that list. So when we see conceptual knowledge and the Collins and Loftus spreading activation model, we'll come back to this example because the spreading activation model gives a really nice and elegant explanation of why that occurs. But basically, it's the meaning and the fact that all of these were associated with sleep. And when you were reconstructing the list, you weren't going back to replay that 2 minutes that the list was being presented. What you're doing is you're piecing together knowledge that you have about how these words go together. And then, like you said, subconsciously, you just recall that sleep was on the list, even though it wasn't on the list. So, this is one of the reasons why the metaphor of the filing cabinet was abandoned in terms of a model for how our memory works. So, this is also a nice example of just realizing that in order to make sense of the mind is something that is really, really difficult to understand. It's probably the most complicated thing in the universe that we are trying to understand. And the best way that you can do that as human beings is to just use concepts that you already have, use things that you already understand. And in the 60s, when research on memory was exploding, One thing that they had was they had filing cabinets. And they said to themselves, you know what? Maybe memory works like a filing cabinet. Let's go with that one. And there's a place where you put long-term files, and there's a inbox where you put short-term files with working memory. Maybe that's the way that it works. And then an experiment like this one comes along, and then you think about, well, if I put all the words that I just saw on that list into a particular file, into a particular drawer, and then I go to that drawer, I might be able to pull out all the words that were on the list. Because if I put all the files into the drawer and then I go to that drawer, the only files in there should be the files that I put in. That's the way a filing cabinet works. The fact that we were able to induce this false memory of sleep, that you went to that filing cabinet and a file that you never put in there just magically appeared, that shouldn't actually happen if your memory works like a filing system. But the fact that it actually did happen and sleep somehow found its way into your recall of this list means that it's not put together like a filing cabinet. It's more reconstructed. You can imagine of files spread out across the entire room. And as you're going through that, pulling peace, pulling yawn, pulling drowsy, pulling snore, you are likely to pull sleep, even though the file for sleep was never actually created, was never actually presented on that list. All right, so that is kind of the basic idea of reconstructive memory. We are now going to take a look at some research that's being done that is basically borderline science fiction. And I say that it's basically borderline science fiction because it kind of sounds like it's directly taken from a science fiction movie called The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So if you've seen this movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, I got the trailer, just kind of give you the gist. But what we're about to see in the treatment of Genevieve is basically a pharmaceutical way of doing what they did in this film. So let's just take a look at the trailer to get an idea of just how science fiction-y we're about to get.
The following is a paid advertisement from Lacuna Incorporated. The views expressed do not reflect the opinions of the management of this theater.
Hello, I'm Howard Mirziak, founder and president of Lacuna Incorporated. Why remember a destructive love affair? Here at Lacuna, we have perfected a safe, effective technique for the focused erasure of troubling memories. In a matter of hours, our patented non-surgical procedure will rid you of painful memories and allow you a new and lasting peace of mind you'd never imagined possible.
This is a hoax, right?
I assure you no.
Is there any risk of brain damage?
It's on a par with a night of heavy drinking. Nothing you'll miss.
Can you hear me? I don't want this anymore. I want to call it off. All right, so that movie is science fiction, but we're going to see just how close that is to getting to science fact. But before we get there, just because of our discussion that we had on encoding specificity and infantile amnesia, I just wonder, number one, how much of this was practical effects? Number two, what did Jim Carrey go through in terms of his emotional memories, or maybe even some semantic memories from his childhood? If he was placed in a situation like this, did stuff come flooding back because the cues in this kind of situation would have matched what he had as a child? So be interesting to know that, but let's get on with the memory reconstruction. So Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, science fiction, story of Genevieve, science fact. So once again, this is Genevieve, and we're going to see that researchers trying to treat her are attempting something massively remarkable. And what they're going to do is they're going to ask Genevieve to deliberately recall her traumatic memory. And then at that moment of reconstruction, they're going to attempt to alter the recoding of that memory. So the fact that the memory is being reconstructed, you can think of it in terms of trying to put together a puzzle. When you're about halfway through putting together that puzzle, when you're reconstructing things, that's when they're at their most vulnerable. So if you have a traumatic memory that is just not fading, just not going away, maybe through recalling it, which is reconstructing that memory, it can make it vulnerable. And then you can interfere with the recoding of that memory. And in effect, much like in the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, start to erase the actual memory, as we're going to see, not all of the memory, but at the very least, erase the traumatic aspect of that memory. So without further ado, let's go back to Horizon. How does memory work? And we're going to watch the treatment of Genevieve. So that seems low. They would need to know how was that operationalized. 10%, only 1 in 10 want to forget something. That seems kind of low, but back to Genevieve. Comment on her situation. So that was 9 years. This was filmed 9 years after the assault. And we literally, in our language, we have the phrase, time heals all wounds, right? So the idea is that even with memories that are traumatic, eventually the traumatic experience fades. Eventually you get over it, right? Eventually you just come to a point where you process the emotion enough, you process the memory enough, and you can get on and function in your daily life, with your relationships, with your work, with your life. For whatever reason, this has not happened for Genevieve. She has the intense emotions still occurring, still coming back when she relives that event, cannot function in a way that is optimal and typical. So she feels the outside world is dangerous. She doesn't want to go outside. So this is clearly a case where time has not healed all wounds. So now we're going to see if we can use psychology's knowledge of how memory actually works to try to help Genevieve. Literally is your Nobel Prize right there. If you can bridge the gap in memory, for example, between the representations that are used in the mind, Mars tri-level hypothesis level 2, and you can bridge that down to the implementation. How does it work in the actual neurons in the brain cell? That is one of another really interesting dissociation that we can take a look at between different memory functions. So we're going to see that the episodic memory of the assault, that's not affected. Genevieve is not losing details about what actually happened, but the emotional aspects of it are going to be blocked. Those can be toned down. And again, that's something that happens as we process emotions, as we process memories and emotions. Like they said with the breakup, you don't lose the details of the breakup, but you kind of get over it and you kind of, feel it feels less traumatic as you go along. So that's a nice example of another functional dissociation, in the sense that that would indicate that there is basic differences in terms of representation and in terms of how your mind actually represents these things between episodic memory and emotional memory. The fact that you can maintain one but lose the other is indication. All right, so just real quick about why we're here and why we do the work that we do. Just to give you a timeline on this, Genevieve was assaulted 9 years prior to this treatment. So for 9 years, she had well-meaning individuals, people trying to support her, people trying to help her to deal with this trauma, to deal with this memory, but they just couldn't do it. And these were well-meaning people, I'm sure, well-meaning people who put in a lot of effort, a lot of care, but just didn't have the know-how, didn't have the tools to create a therapy that matched up with how our minds actually work. So one of the big reasons that we're doing what we do here is because well-intentioned effortful, hardworking people were helping Genevieve for 9 years, and her symptoms were not getting better. The trauma was still there. She could not feel safe going out of her house. 6 weeks. This is a 6-week program that has taken her emotions down by 1 1/3. That has decreased her physiological responses, at least when she's imagining the event. So in 6 weeks, she's made more progress than she had in 9 years. And that is because now she is getting therapies and interventions that are designed by people who know how the mind works and know the ins and outs and how things are represented. And again, that's why we're here doing what we do, to figure out how does our human mind work so we can do work like this and help people. And so just real quick, erasing memories are possible. You can ask Clive Waring if they're possible. But I think, he makes a good point that part of our identity, part of who we are, is tied up in this idea of a continuous episodic line of just being able to exist and being able to recall what has happened to you. Okay, so before we leave that, any questions, comments about the treatment or about how reconstructive memory was being used here? Okay, so before we leave this, just one last time, this treatment and what they were doing was built on the idea, the finding that memories are reconstructed when you recall them. Because if they weren't reconstructed and put back into that malleable, vulnerable form, none of this would have actually been possible. So again, those lists of 15 words that gave that indication that, hey, maybe memory is being reconstructed because we have these false memories, led to work like this with propranolol and the treatment of Genevieve. All right. Oh, yep.
Has that study been reproduced in other people? Like, have other people experienced the same loss of emotional effects of recall memories?
There is, yes. So there is a lot of experimental evidence that uh, generalizes, to other individuals as well. So I'm just looking at some of the notes. There's studies that report improvements in PTSD symptoms, reductions of 40 to 50% in self-report measures after treatment in some trials, um, reduced physiological responses to trauma. The caveat is that the findings are not universally conclusive. So some studies show comparable effects to placebo during the treatment phase, though propranolol might offer sustained benefits over time. I'm just reading directly off of the summary here. So this is something that has been studied across a wide number of individuals. It's not, as far as I can tell, as robust as certain other treatments. It does say here that it's approved by the FDA for conditions like hypertension, migraines, and anxiety, but not specifically for PTSD or emotional memory modification. Its use for PTSD remains off-label. So this was, what are the challenges to approval? There's a lot of evidence that this works, but it's not as clean as, I guess, certain government bodies need in order to have it approved specifically for that, I would imagine. But it definitely, I mean, it seems almost too good to be true. It does seem kind of like this science fiction-y, thing that we can do. Um, so yeah, the last note that I have here yet is that it shows potential as a treatment for PTSD through memory reconsolidation interference, but not yet approved for public use. More robust evidence and regulatory guidance are required before it can become a widely available therapeutic option. So it's still in the testing phases, still in the, I guess, the development phases of the use of the drug. All right. Any other questions on Genevieve and her treatment? All right. So we are now going to have a very brief aside that is related to reconstructive memory, but is about the importance of writing and the importance of being able to write and produce clear, understandable writing. So this is going to be a story that is familiar to anybody that took my Methods of Experimental Psychology class. But in that class, we do a project, they write up a research paper, and it's on reconstructive memory. So we do a demonstration in class where we put people into different size groups. Some are in groups of 3, some are in groups of 2, some people do it alone. And then we find how many false memories are produced if you're working together with other people or if you're working alone. And spoiler alert, it's not good news. If you are working with groups, you will produce more correct memories. So you will recall more of the correct items on these lists. You will produce just as many false memories, but you will be way more confident about the false memories that you do produce. So if you are alone and you see that list of words and you recall the word sleep, and I asked you to rate how confident were you that the word sleep was on the list, you might give it like a 1 out of 4 or a 2 out of 4. If you're in a group and you recall sleep, you will have that as a 3 or a 4. You will be way more confident in your false recall. So be careful anytime you're working with groups. The possibility that a false memory will invade and you will be very confident about it increases. However, part of the background reading that they need to do for that project is this classic paper here by James Deese, came out in 1959, and it's on the prediction of occurrence of particular verbal intrusions in immediate recall. So the verbal intrusions, those are false memories. And this is a really strange kind of case in the history of science. This original study came out in 1959, and it was basically rediscovered 40 years later. So these findings were buried for about 40 years. And then it was rediscovered with the same idea, the same logic, the same phenomenon. So the question that I'll pose to you is, how could an important psychological discovery, the discovery of false memories that could lead you to figure out that memory is reconstructive, how could this important psychological discovery sit there for decades before it got rediscovered?
Was there a generational or philosophical difference in the approach at the time it was written?
So one possibility is that there was some sort of generational or philosophical difference. So it might have been that in 1959, behaviorism was going crazy, right? Everybody was a behaviorist. So somebody comes along and says, well, hey, I have this study about, what's going on inside your mind. And they're all like, there's nothing inside the mind. It's all in the environment. So that is one possibility. It might have been that the ideas that he was putting forth, they just weren't kind of the scientific community wasn't ready for it. They weren't, the concepts weren't there in order to understand it. Any other speculations about what might have done this? So one of the reasons that I assigned this in my learning how to write APA style papers class is because if you were to read this paper, which I force my students to do, you will find out that it is really difficult to read. This is not a well-written paper. So it's obtuse, it's hard to get through. You have lines like a plausible ex post facto account can be given for most extra list intrusions after they have occurred, but heretofore no scheme has been developed for predicting their occurrence. It's difficult to kind of get through. And I believe that is the reason why this was buried when it was, because it was so difficult to get through that humans, right? Sometimes we forget that researchers and scientists are humans. Humans had to read this and they had to go through it. And I believe one of two things happened. Either they forced themselves to go through the whole thing and they might have missed exactly what he was reporting. They might have missed exactly what the implications of it were, right? Almost like in this class, sometimes when I explain a theory and I'm asking, hey, what are some of the implications? What are some of the speculations? If you're sitting there and you think to yourself, man, I don't understand that theory at all, you're not going to come up with implications or speculations, right? You're just not going to be in that position. So either they read through this thing and they weren't able to come up with those implications because their mind was so overwhelmed with trying to decode what it was that was written, or they started reading this thing, found it incredibly difficult, and thought to themselves, I got 16 other papers that I want to read this week. So I'm just going to, forget this one. Like, we'll just go on to the next. And the horrible thing that happened is that the idea of false memories and the way that your mind really works would have been amazing to get out into our public consciousness, into mainstream knowledge back in the 60s, because in the 80s, we had this cultural event known as the Satanic Panic. So if you want to find out more about the Satanic Panic, I highly, highly recommend checking out Satan Wants You, which is a documentary about how the Satanic Panic began. But it was a moral panic of unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse, starting in North America, and it started in the 1980s. It spread through many parts of the world by the late 1990s, and it's still kind of persisting today. So part of this, if you've ever heard the urban legend about Dungeons and Dragons being a gateway to satanic practices, that started as part of the satanic practice. If you've ever heard stories about a satanic panic, if you've ever heard stories about heavy metal music having secret lyrics, or if you play it backwards, you can open portals to hell, that was also part of the satanic panic. But the issue here was that this all started, and this documentary makes it very, very explicit. This all started with the false recovery of memories. So false memories were recovered, particularly in the context of alleged childhood sexual abuse. And at this time, people were not very aware of the existence of false memories. Deese showed that false memories exist back in 1959. But in the 80s, that was not still widely known. And what happened was Roediger and McDermott in 1995, okay, so about 4 decades after Deese and about 5 years or 15 years after the Satanic Panic began, Roediger and McDermott basically rediscovered Deese, just redid his experiments. This is one of the cleanest cases of just replicating an experiment. So they just redid the experiment, and then they published this paper, and the impact of this paper was massive. So we'll take a look at it here visually. So on the bottom axis there, you got the decade. So the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all the way up to the 2010s. And then on the y-axis there, you have the number of citations per decade. And we're going to see how many citations Deese got. He's going to be the red line, and how many citations Roediger and McDermott got. Citations are basically a way of measuring how much of an impact has your research paper produced. How many people are reading it? How many people think it's important? How many people say to themselves, I need to include this in my work? That's where a citation comes from. So we start with the 1950s and take a look all the way up to the 1990s. This was Deese's number of citations. So his citations were very low, below 100, even, in the 1990s there. So very few people were reading the paper by Deese. Very few people were acknowledging it as important in their research. It just wasn't having any impact. In 1995, Roediger and McDermott published their work, and this is the number of citations they received. So their work had a huge impact. And if you actually look at the number of citations that Dease has now, you'll see that Dease actually does have one of the most highly cited papers in memory research in history. But if you take a look at when those citations happened, they all happened after Roediger and McDermott's paper was written. So people read Roediger and McDermott's paper and then said, I want to know more about this. Let me check out the original. Let me check out Dease. And that's when they got, Dease got more citations. Good writing matters, because if Dease wrote more clearly and wrote more concisely and wrote more understandably, then in the 1980s, when the Satanic Panic occurred, people would have known about false memories. And when those allegations were made against daycare owners, against school teachers, against parents, when those allegations were made, they would have known it's possible that these were reconstructed false memories that were created because of the way the children were questioned, because of the suggestions that were put into their mind. The Satanic Panic saw 12,000 unsubstantiated cases brought to court. And just kind of try to put yourself in the shoes of one of those individuals, where you are caring for children because you care for children, right? You do it because you feel like you want to help children out. And then somebody comes to you and accuses you of doing horrible, horrible things that you have never done. And the children that you are taking care of are witnesses against you. Just imagine what that must have been like. It happened 12,000 times. So false recovered memories are discovered at that time. If we could have reversed those arrows, who knows how many fewer of those 12,000 people would have been accused. Who knows if the Satanic Panic would have become a Satanic Panic. Chances are, at the very least, it would have been reduced. And again, this is just an indication that clear writing in psychology and in science matters. It's not just a matter of making it nice and making it pretty. If you want your work to have an impact, you have to communicate it clearly. So we're going to leave that for now, just to kind of give you another reference. If you want to take a look at kind of like an overview of this type of work for, the last 100 years, The Fallibility of Memory in Judicial Processes, Lessons from the Past and Their Modern Consequences by Howe and Not, highly recommend. Take a look at that review paper. And this is another one that kind of research touches on and kind of presents a sobering message for our society. So if you recall, the work that I do in the class, Methods of Experimental Psychology, and the demo that we go and have the students complete, shows that if you're in a group, you will have just as many false memories as you would when you're alone, but you will be more confident that those false memories are actually true. So if you think about a place where you have a group, and it would be horrible for them to be confident about a false memory, you start to wonder if maybe the jury system that we have might not be the best way to actually get at the truth. Again, this is the things that psychologists can address and hopefully put it out into the world so that we can make this a more accurate and truthful place. All right, so any questions or comments on the importance of good writing? All right, and I will say, just like as a final kind of things, one of the great things that you can use ChatGPT for, and I use ChatGPT for all the time, is you can write something and then you can just give it to ChatGPT and say, is this clear? Can this be improved? Is this readable? Will people remember this? And it oftentimes just says, you need to work on this. You should move this over here. You should move this over here. That's the way that it would be best presented. It's a great tool to make things more readable. If Dease had ChatGPT, we might have avoided the Satanic Panic. Just saying. All right. So that's going to be it for our look at memory. We are now going to introduce the idea of conceptual knowledge, and then we're going to dive in on that in more detail next time. But let's just get some basic concepts down. So we'll talk about semantic networks, and then we might get to Colin and Killian's hierarchical model. But at the very least, let's introduce those semantic networks. So let's see if what's in our own semantic networks right now. Does anybody know who that is? Right, I see. So it's not a trick question, is it? It's Abraham Lincoln. So we all know that that is Abraham Lincoln. We know certain things about him. He delivered the Gettysburg Address. He was the 16th president of the United States. This, I believe, is either the only or the earliest photograph of Abraham Lincoln. So that's him right there. If you're ever wondering what he actually kind of looks like in real life. So that's an image of him right there. So we know certain things about Abraham Lincoln. We have them stored in our minds. How are these things that we know about Abraham Lincoln actually stored? Well, that is what a semantic network tries to address. So we're going to take a look at a number of different semantic networks over the next few classes. Well, let's just kind of take an overview of what a semantic network actually is, and then we'll take a look at specific examples of how they've tried to understand these semantic networks. So semantic knowledge, you can think of it as a list of propositions. So these are your knowledge for facts. These are your knowledge for meanings that you know. So you can think of, if somebody asked you to write down everything that you know, you could write out your semantic knowledge. So one of the things that you would write, for example, was Lincoln, who was president of the United States, delivered the Gettysburg Address. And what that means, if you can say this, if you can produce this declarative statement, that means that this was somehow represented in your semantic network. So these propositions in your network, they're represented as nodes, and the nodes are the relations or the arguments in that proposition. And then we also have links, and the links are the connections between the nodes. So we're going to see how we can take nodes, which again are relations or arguments, and then links, and then come up with a representation in your mind of that statement. Lincoln, who was president of the United States, delivered the Gettysburg Address. All right, so we start off with some nodes. So we're going to start off with a relation. So the first relation is agent. So agent indicates the type of, I don't want to use the word relation. Agent represents how the next part of the node is going to work. All right, so clearly that is not in my semantic network, how to say agent without, how to say relation without relation. But basically, you have the relation represented there, and then attached to that, you have the argument. So this is what lets you know that we are going to be talking about Lincoln. So this is going to be about Lincoln. Lincoln has a relation of agent. He has agency. This is going to be about Lincoln. That's what I was trying to say. So this is how we represent that this statement is going to be about Lincoln. Now, what else is in our semantic network? Well, we have another relation, and this relation is a relation, and this one links to the argument of president of. So now we know that the agent of this node, who is Lincoln, is going to be related by president of. So Lincoln is president of. And then we need to know, well, president of what? So we have the relation of an object, and that object is the United States. So on this node, we have the agent Lincoln is related via president of to the object United States. Lincoln is a president of the United States. That's how that first part of the proposition would be represented in your semantic network. We have more information, though, that we know. So we have, again, the relationship of agent. And on this new node, we have the relationship of agent, and that's going to link to our argument of Lincoln. So now we're linking other things to Lincoln. The Lincoln link from LinkedIn. Anyway, so we link another node to the to the argument of Lincoln, and now we can represent other things about Lincoln. Now we can expand our knowledge about Lincoln. So now on this new node, we have another relation, and that relation is the relation of delivered. So now we know that Lincoln is going to deliver something. What is he going to deliver? Well, we have the relation of object, and the object that he's delivering is the Gettysburg Address. So now in this semantic network that we have developed, we have the agent Lincoln with the relation president of to the object United States, and that agent Lincoln also has relationship of delivered to the object of Gettysburg Address. Decode the whole thing. Lincoln, who was president of the United States, delivered the Gettysburg Address. And that's how we can represent that proposition in our semantic network. All right. Any questions about that? Okay, good. So I didn't flub up the relation part too bad at the beginning. Okay. So let's see some of the implications of this. We just saw how the drug propranolol, yes, it was propranolol. We just saw how the drug propranolol was able to inhibit the recoding of emotional memories and basically erase those emotional memories. So that was a little bit of science fiction. If we push that science fiction even further, if we go to like inception levels of science fiction, let's say that we are actually able to go into somebody's mind and start moving around things in their semantic networks, right? Let's say that some billionaire inventor comes to us and says, hey, you know what? I want you to insert my accomplishments into people's minds, inception style. And you know what? I don't really care if you have to get rid of Lincoln to do it. Just make sure that I'm in there. Hijack their semantic networks. I want to be in there. So you accept this mission for some reason. And you say, all right, mystery billionaire, I'll do it for you. So we're going to go to the argument Lincoln. And we're going to say, hey, that agent relationship that is pointing to Lincoln, well, we're going to swap out that argument Lincoln. And for reasons only known to the mysterious billionaire who hired us, we're going to put in Bill Gates. So we have taken out the argument Lincoln and we've now put in Bill Gates. Now this semantic network says Bill Gates, who was relation of president to object United States and relation delivered to object Gettysburg Address, Bill Gates, president of the United States, delivered the Gettysburg Address. And then we go further and we keep incepting and we say, hey, you know what? That object of the United States, we need to change that. So let's change the object of United States to Microsoft. And now we have a semantic network that represents Bill Gates, who was president of Microsoft, delivered the Gettysburg Address. And we keep incepting because we're not done yet. And we say, hey, that relation of delivered, that needs to go as well. We can hijack that argument. So let's take out delivered, the argument delivered, and we're going to put in the argument programmed. And now we have Bill Gates, who was president of Microsoft, programmed the Gettysburg Address. And then finally, we got the object relation of Gettysburg Address. We need to incept that and switch that around. And we change that to Windows. And then finally, we have Bill Gates, who was president of Microsoft, programmed the Windows. And there we have our successful inception. So if this was actually possible, two things would occur. So first thing that would occur is that if you were able to replace the argument Lincoln with Bill Gates, you would first off completely forget who Lincoln was. You would have no idea about anybody called Lincoln. So if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, have you heard of this guy, Abraham Lincoln?" You would be like, "No, is he a friend of yours? Does he go to school with you? I've never heard of this person before." Because that node, that argument is gone. The second thing is that we only have part of Lincoln's semantic network represented here, right? For educational purposes. If we were actually able to do that, anything else that you knew about Lincoln would now be about Bill Gates. So Bill Gates wore pipe top hats. Bill Gates, was did the Emancipation Proclamation. You can see my Canadian background showing up here. We don't do American history in elementary school. So, but basically everything that you know about Abraham Lincoln would be replaced and now linked to Bill Gates. So you would have to do a lot more inception to kind of make it more accurate. But the point is that you can see here we have two different semantic networks here, two different ways of representing knowledge, but it's the same basic idea. You have these links between ideas, such as Lincoln and Bill Gates. You have these links between relations, such as object or agent. And using those links, you can produce and represent your semantic knowledge. So the question then becomes, if this is the way that our semantic knowledge might be represented in our minds, if these connections are the ways that we represent our semantic knowledge, well then how is this semantic network actually organized? And to take a look at that, we are going to just introduce Colin and Killian's hierarchical model. And then next class, we're going to dive in deeper to it. But we'll just introduce the idea for now. And we'll let you think on it a little bit and see what kind of implications might occur. All right. So Collins and Killian's hierarchical model. This is a hierarchical model of semantic knowledge. And what they basically supposed was that the way that this information is organized in terms of categorical hierarchies. So for example, if you were going to represent your knowledge of animals, then at the top of this semantic network, you would have the argument animal, right? So we're going to talk about animals. That is your super category. And you would link certain features to this top category. So you would say, all right, the animals have skin. So this is something that is true of all animals. So we're going to link it to the top. Animals have skin. Animals can move around. Animals eat. Animals breathe, right? So these are all features that are attached to that category that is the topmost category in this particular hierarchical semantic network. And then in order to represent your knowledge of more specific groups of animals, you have subcategories beneath that top category. So you have the subcategory linked to animal so that you know that it's an animal, but now you have the subcategory of bird. And now you have knowledge or features directly linked to this category that are true of birds. So things like birds have wings. Birds can fly. Birds have feathers. And then in order to represent specific birds, you would go one level down. And this is where you actually have your knowledge stored about specific instances of bird. So for example, this is where you would put the knowledge that a canary can sing, that a canary is yellow. This is where you would put the knowledge that an ostrich is tall, that an ostrich can't fly, that an ostrich has long, thin legs. And then this is the way that you would build up all of your knowledge. So for example, everything that you know about fish would be stored beneath the category of animal because fish are animals. And then all the features specific to fishes would be connected to that fish node. So fish have fins, fish can swim, fish have gills. And then specific fish would be represented under that category. So you would have things like a shark can bite, a shark is dangerous, um, shark has lifeless eyes, black eyes like a doll's eyes till he bites you, and then those black eyes roll over away. All right, I won't do the whole thing. Salmon is pink. Salmon is edible. So this was their model, and it was their model of conceptual knowledge. It was a propositional network, so a semantic network. And what I'll leave you with today are just some of the assumptions so that you can get an idea of how this model works, and then start thinking about what those implications are of if your knowledge was organized like this. So, assumption number one, retrieving a property takes time. So to access this network and retrieve can move around from the animal node. That takes time, right? It takes processing time in your mind. To be at ostrich and retrieve can't fly. That takes a certain amount of time. And traversing the hierarchy also takes time. So if you're thinking about birds and I ask you to answer a question about canaries, it's going to take you time to go from bird down to canary and then access the features about canaries. So moving around this network actually takes a little bit of time. And then assumption number two is that these times are additive when one step is dependent on the completion of another. So if you need to go from animal all the way down to ostrich, you need to go from animal to bird and from bird to ostrich. So that's going to take you longer than going from animal to bird. So moving around this network is kind of moving around roads on a map. If you need to get to one destination before you can go to another destination, your trip time is going to be added. All right. And then assumption number three, the time to retrieve a property is independent of the hierarchy level. And what that means is that if I'm asking you things about animals and you have to retrieve, yes, animals eat, that's going to take you the same amount of time as if I ask you if a shark is dangerous and you have to retrieve shark is dangerous. So you're not faster in the top hierarchies. You're not slower in the bottom hierarchies. Whatever hierarchy you're in, whatever level you're at, it takes the same amount of time to retrieve a property independent of what level you're at. So the question we're going to leave with today is what would happen if your conceptual knowledge was organized this way, and specifically think about what type of questions or cognition would take longer and what type of questions and cognitions would take less time. So if you're thinking about canaries and you needed to answer a question about another animal, what animal would take the longest for you to answer that question about? Would it be an ostrich or would it be a salmon? If you're up at the hierarchy of animal and you have to answer a question about fish, is that going to take you longer than answering a question about sharks, or is it going to take you the same time? So try to think about traversing this network. And then next time when we take a look at this, we're going to take a look at some experimental studies that actually measured how fast and what are the properties of these semantic networks. And then we're going to see some really kind of frustrating, probably for Collins and Killian's, exceptions, because as it turns out, there are some instances where the hierarchical model breaks down. And one of those are for very prototypical examples like robins and dogs. But we're going to get to that next time. So any questions before we wrap this up? All right. That is it for today.